All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of Headlines in History. And I'm excited to be joined today by New York Times reporter Declan Walsh. And Declan actually just received a big prize here at ISD that we gave out to him last week, the Weintal Prize for Diplomatic Reporting. So, Declan, congrats again on that. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Kelly. It's good to be here.
So last week at his talk, the remarks he gave at the talk were about Sudan, and some of our listeners may have been reading some of Declan's recent reporting on the war in Sudan and what's going on there. It's been excellent reporting and keeping that issue on the front burner as much as possible. So there's been a lot of activity in Sudan in the last few weeks, and we wanted to bring Declan in to sort of update us on the most recent activities, things that have been going on in regards to the war. But before we get into that, Declan, we've talked about Sudan a few times on the podcast over the course of the past couple of years. But can you give us a little bit of a higher level overview of this round of fighting that kicked off in 2023, kind of leading us up to the last couple of weeks?
Sure. Well, very briefly, I'll start in 2019, just as useful
Yeah.
framing. So in 2019, there's an uprising in Sudan. The country's leader of 3 decades, Omar Bashir, is overthrown under pressure from street protesters, but is removed through effectively a military coup led by his top generals. The two most senior generals in the country are the leader of the military, General Burhan, and the leader of this paramilitary group, the RSF, General Hamdan, also known as Hemeti. And there's a democratic transition or the start of one for a couple of years, but then these two generals seize power themselves in 2021. And there follows after that 2 years of growing tensions, effectively over how to share power and over a
Mhm.
proposal that they might merge their forces. And that's what led to this outbreak of fighting on the streets of Khartoum in April 2023 that very quickly spread across the country and has now engulfed all of Sudan, plunging it into this enormous humanitarian crisis, the worst one in the world, displaced 12, 13 million people from their homes, led to probably hundreds of thousands of deaths, and a famine that is spreading. But that has also drawn in a whole plethora of local armed groups which had been sort of dormant or semi-dormant for years. Now they're involved in the fight. And then to complicate matters further, you have this array of foreign powers that have taken sides on one side or the other, supplying money, weapons, political support, trying to back a winner in this war, but consequently just making it so much harder to even get a ceasefire, let alone a peace.
Yeah, so you talked in your remarks last week quite a bit about those outside powers that these middle powers that are playing a role in this fight. And could you expand on that a little bit? You mentioned the United Arab Emirates quite a bit as well. What's their stake in this, and what do they care about what's going on in Sudan?
They all care for different things. The Sudan is a country that, even though I suppose in some listeners' minds might be associated with conflict, of course, it's had many wars over the years and poverty to some degree. Actually, it's a country that's endowed with enormous natural wealth. It's got some of the deepest gold reserves in Africa. It's strategically located along the Red Sea. It's got enormous tracts of very rich agricultural land along the Nile. And of course, it's just an enormous country in a very strategic location, near the Sahel, near the Red Sea, pointing towards the Mediterranean. So there's a lot to fight over in Sudan, and the different countries that are involved on either side of the fight have really got different motivations. But the big difference between the two sides is that on the Sudan military side, the military has a sort of galaxy of what I would call supporters, countries that are providing either selling or supplying in other ways, weapons, and they range from Turkey and Iran and Russia to also Egypt and Saudi Arabia. On the RSF side, it's a lot simpler. There's just one country that's really the main foreign backer, and that's the United Arab Emirates. And the United Arab Emirates is one of the richest countries in the region, if not in the world, actually. And
Mhm.
so the mystery for many people is, why do they have a dog in this fight? Why have they thrown their weight behind this group, which now is accused of so many atrocities and bringing a lot of reputational liability for the UAE. And my way of thinking of it is that there's several different answers. One is, there's that resources question, about gold or ports, access to the sea. There's also a question about politics. The Emirates has for years been directed in the region by a hostility towards what it sees as the forces of political Islam. And the Sudanese military, under its previous ruler, President Bashir, was seen as a sort of Islamist regime.
Mhm.
And then I think the other factor is that for the Emirates, this is part of a much wider drive for influence and place on the continent of Africa that has taken shape very suddenly, really over the last 4 or 5 years, and has seen the Emirates become an enormous investor in minerals, in ports, in commercial businesses in many African countries. But in Sudan and in the Horn of Africa, it has forged these political alliances with a view to really helping to sway the direction of these countries politically as well.
Yeah, and as you noted last week, it's really aiding and continuing this war to an extent. But things did, so to speak, come to a head a little bit in the last few weeks with the siege of Al Fasher and the RSF taking that over. So, can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of Al Fasher and the siege, and then what happened there a couple weeks ago?
So El Fasher has been a prize in the war for about the last 18 months. It was, until very recently, the last major city in the Darfur region that the RSF did not control. At the start
Mhm.
of the war, the RSF, which is a sort of successor movement to the Janjaweed militias that were so notorious in Darfur 20 years ago. But the RSF is an armed force that is really rooted in Darfur. Its leaders are from Darfur. Most of its fighters are from that region. And so El Fasher had become the last city, not the last territory, but the last city in the region that was standing between the RSF and complete control. But it couldn't capture it. The Sudanese military had really dug in. It had a garrison in the city, and it was getting help from fighters from other Darfuri groups that were fighting alongside it. So about 18 months ago, the RSF started laying siege to the city, and that siege really accelerated about 6 months ago after the RSF was expelled, or its forces were expelled from the capital, Khartoum, after the Sudanese military pushed them out in what looked like a huge win for the military at that
Mhm.
time, and caused the RSF to really redouble its efforts to capture El Fasher. And so what we saw was the RSF tightening the noose around this city. They built this enormous earthen berm that eventually encircled El Fasher entirely. It was about 40 miles long. And that effectively choked El Fasher, and about 250,000 people left inside. So it cut off supplies of food, it cut off supplies of essential medicines, and it made it very easy for the RSF to control who was going in and out. And we had reports of people who tried to slip over that obstacle being shot dead. And what it led to until a couple of weeks ago was a situation with incredibly dire circumstances for the people who are trapped in there. I had reached a number of people in El Fasher to tell me about what was going on, and they said that food had become so scarce that most inhabitants of the city had resorted to eating animal feed that was usually reserved for camels and donkeys and other livestock. That had become their staple food, and even at some point, that was running out. So the city was starving. It was under constant attack by drones and artillery and other heavy armaments. And then eventually, about 2 weeks ago, the RSF finally expelled the Sudanese military from the city, captured it whole cloth. And what's happened since then is we've seen this stream of videos and witness testimony and satellite pictures that have painted this really horrific picture of what happened after the RSF captured the city. Basically, there have been accounts of massacres by RSF fighters against people they found in their way. People who fled the cities have said that they were shot at as they tried to leave. They left behind streets that were littered with bodies. The World Health Organization said that 460 people had been killed in the city's last functioning hospital when the RSF took over. So really, there's just been, and it has to be said, a lot of these videos portraying these atrocities by fighters were filmed by the fighters themselves, continuing this trend of sort of war trophies by the RSF or since this war started, but also a way of signaling to people in areas that they don't control that if they don't bow to their will, that this potentially is the fate that they could suffer. So we've seen just these horrific scenes that have, I think generated quite a lot of outrage, not just in Sudan, but more widely about what's been happening in El Fasher.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too, and you mentioned this in your remarks last week, that in light of the siege of Al Fasher and what's been going on in Sudan and the fighting, that the famine that's occurring there is a wholly man-made famine as well. It's not that they can't, we can't produce food or things like that, but it's being used as a weapon of war to starve out these people and things like that. And just it fits in with the atrocious nature of the fighting that you're describing there. But surprisingly, I think to a lot of folks, on the flip side of what you just described, in the last few days, I've also seen reports of potential for a ceasefire. So what's behind that you're hearing, and who's involved in that? And it's an odd situation, right? Because the U.S. is involved or has been involved to some extent, but one of its partners that's working with is the UAE, who has a huge role in this war and perpetuating this war. So, where do things stand as far as a ceasefire, and who's sort of working that to try to get it enacted?
Well, over the course of the war, there's been numerous attempts by different countries to try and get even a brief ceasefire, and all have failed dismally. But this latest push is led by the U.S. At the start of the Trump administration, there really appeared to be very little interest from the White House or from Washington in the war in Sudan. But that started to change during the summer when President Trump's Africa envoy, Masad Boulos, started to draw together diplomats, especially from the Arab countries that are major backers of either side of the war. And that culminated in the formation of this new diplomatic grouping in September that's known as the Quad. That's the United States, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt. And Boulos brought these people together for talks about Sudan, and in September produced a sort of sketch of what at least a humanitarian ceasefire might look like, and a potential path for talks to a more lasting peace afterwards. Now, at the time, frankly, this plan didn't generate a huge amount of enthusiasm. I think partly because so many initiatives have failed before, and also because of a certain degree of skepticism over the element you just mentioned, which is that, here is President Trump's envoy trying to make peace with the same countries that are fueling either side in the war. But I guess the counter to that is that you don't make peace with, peaceniks. You make peace with people who are fueling the war. So perhaps that's the right approach. But having said that, even though these powerful Arab countries signed up to this declaration in September, that didn't seem to have much impact on the ground in Fasher as this siege tightened and these terrible scenes unfolded. So I think there's still quite a lot of healthy skepticism about the chances for success of this initiative. But it must be said, it's probably the most concerted, ceasefire push. And I think they're calling it a humanitarian truce is the first thing they want to achieve. And it's probably the most concerted one since the war started. And it actually last week led the RSF to make a declaration that it was ready to abide by this truce. Now, it was unclear at the time whether that was just a SOP by the RSF in order to try and quell some of the mounting international criticism over what was happening in Al Fasher. And almost immediately, the Sudanese military appeared to dismiss that suggestion out of hand. But, again, it's probably fair to say that that is more movement towards a ceasefire, or at least, concerted diplomatic activity than we've seen in a long time in this conflict.
So if a ceasefire did happen, what is in it for the RSF? I mean, do you think it's just, they've reached their objective in Al Fasher and now can kind of make this kind of ceasefire movement?
Well, there's a history in this war, like in many conflicts, where the folks who are ready to agree to a ceasefire are usually the ones who've just won something, and the folks who've just
Right.
lost are the ones who don't want to. And I think to some degree that's what we're seeing playing out here. But your question does get to a broader one that still really puzzles a lot of people, which is, what do the RSF want to get out of this war at the end
Yeah.
of it? At the beginning, it was clear that they were aiming for control of the entire country, or at least, they were fighting in Khartoum. They controlled the capital for about 2 years. They held on to it tenaciously. They had troops, across the breadth of Sudan, almost. Now they're much more boxed into the west of the country, in around Darfur and neighboring Kordofans. So you've got to wonder at this point, would the RSF want to stop fighting and sort of use what they now control as a basis to negotiate? There's talk that Sudan could potentially de facto partition into two
Mhm.
different areas of control. I mean, that's already happened de
Right.
facto. You have the army in the east and the RSF in the west. But is that would that be a lasting? Would that be a satisfactory arrangement? Beyond an initial ceasefire? I mean, I doubt it. But it's really unclear at this point what the kind of overriding political objective of the RSF is at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, though, I think I imagine you'll agree, any sort of humanitarian ceasefire at this point is good. So, last question, real quick. As we're hearing about these potential or these talks on the ceasefire and the potential of that, are there, one or two sort of signposts that you'll be looking for to see whether or not there's positive momentum towards this?
I think, the key to this probably lies in the short term with those foreign powers we talked about. They really are they are the enablers, and they're also the potential restraining factors on belligerents on both sides of the war. In some respects, it's simpler for the RSF because they've got they rely on a network of African countries nearby for help, but really a lot of that is bound together by the UAE. And there are a lot of folks who say that if the UAE wanted to, they could stop this fighting tomorrow because they are such an
Mhm.
important part of the RSF's war machine. On the other side, it's more complicated because the Sudanese military just has this constellation of foreign countries that play a significant role for it. But I would say that among them, probably Egypt and Saudi Arabia are the two to watch. So I think we're going to be watching to see whether these foreign powers, these foreign players rather, especially these Arab countries, show signs of wanting to put pressure on their allies or proxies in order to stop this fight and as you said, bring the kind of desperately needed ceasefire that people want, because it's just so hard to imagine what the political solution to this problem is, or this
Yeah.
conflict is right now. But everybody just wants a stop to the fighting, in the short term.
All right, Declan, thank you so much for joining us. This is, something we've been keeping an eye on, and we'll definitely be watching as this all unfolds. But hopefully, at least there's some sort of humanitarian pause in the coming weeks to get some food in and try to help out some of those folks that need it. So, thanks again.
It was great to speak with you. Thank you, Kelly.